All right, well, welcome everybody. I want to start by acknowledging that we are on Treaty 1 land, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, and Dakota people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We recognize that our collective experience as Manitobans is bound by treaty now and for the future. Reconciliation begins by knowing our history, correcting mistakes, and moving forward in partnership. So welcome everybody to One Green Voice Can Make a Huge Difference. Thank you for coming. My name is Dave Nickarz. I'm the Green Party candidate for Wolseley in the upcoming election. That really rolls off the tongue because I've been saying it since April, every day at the door for hundreds and hundreds of doors, so that's an easy one. What we want to do tonight with our wonderful guests is have a panel discussion. We're going to have some introductions first, and then we're going to have prepared questions by me, and then we're going to open it up to the audience questions. We're going to have a roving mic go around and talk to you people. So first of all, I want to introduce the panelists. First on my left here is Peter Bevan-Baker. He's the Honorable Leader of the Official Opposition in PEI and MLA for New Haven Rocky Point. Next is Hannah Bell, House Leader of the Official Opposition and MLA for Charlottetown-Belvedere. Both Greens, by the way, elected Greens. I know it's hard to believe in this city, but we're going to do it. We're going to do it. Next is Andrea Shalay. She's Deputy Leader of the Green Party of Manitoba and candidate for Union Station. And of course, James Beddome, the Leader of the Green Party of Manitoba and candidate for Fort Rouge. So what we're going to have is we're going to have Peter and Hannah give an introduction. Actually, everybody's going to give a bit of an introduction to who they are and how they got here. And that'll take some time. And yeah, Peter, if you want to start.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's a real delight to be here from Prince Edward Island. I have to say that I've been really charmed with Winnipeg. I've never been here before. And unfortunately, my trip comes to an end tomorrow. But I arrived on Saturday and spent a good chunk of Sunday on a borrowed bike, riding around the downtown. I went down to the Forks. I went to the Legislature. I had a tour of the beautiful Legislature. Holy smokes, what a gorgeous, stunning building that is. And the Museum of Human Rights. I thought I'll just drop in there for an hour. I was there for 3 hours, and just a spectacular place. So I just feel very welcomed here, and even going around the doors, with a few exceptions, things have been remarkably warm and friendly, and it feels very much like home from home. I'm going to start with a little anecdote from this afternoon before I go backwards. And it happened about 4 o'clock this afternoon. I was going door to door with Olivia, who I think just walked in. Yeah, hi Olivia. So she can verify this. And we stopped at a house on Garfield Road, I think it was. And we were just leaving, and a gentleman drove up in a truck and got out and walked through the gate. So we said, oh, hi. So I just left a leaflet in your door and started chatting. And he was from Chile, and I showed him who I was there supporting. I had a Dave Nickarz pamphlet, and he said, oh, the Greens will never win. The Greens will never win in Canada. And so I let him go on for a little while, and then explained who I was, what the Greens had done in Prince Edward Island, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And that actually Greens do win. Greens win frequently these days. And you know what the irony was? He was wearing a Toronto Maple Leafs hat. And I thought, who's going to win here? Anyway, I don't know if you noticed that, Olivia. Yeah, she did. Anyway, it was a cute little thing. I mean, every campaign has its sweet stories, some bittersweet stories, some funny, some not so funny. But I'll remember that, plus walking through a monsoon last night. Our campaign manager promised us, it's just a mist. It's just half a millimeter of rain. And there we were in the gates, just absolutely soaked through, as if we'd gone for a swim in Brackley Beach on PEI. That's how I felt when we got back. Anyway, this is about what difference can one green voice make. And I have some personal experience with that, of course. When I was elected back in 2015 as the first Green MLA on Prince Edward Island, there were only 3 other Greens elected across Canada. Elizabeth May, of course, had, as she does in so many ways, had blazed a trail and had inspired us all in a number of ways. And then Andrew Weaver followed her in British Columbia, David Coon just a few months before our success in Prince Edward Island, all solitary successes. And then I got elected 2015. And that's been the pattern for Greens along the way. One Green has got elected with a very focused campaign in order to accomplish that because, well, for lots of reasons, but our electoral system is the main one. And then that individual, and by the way, when you run for the Green Party, it's not the fast track to electoral success and fulfilling your personal electoral ambitions. It just is not. So people who run for the Greens are doing it they're motivated in other ways. That's true for every single Green Party candidate that I have ever come across in my life. And when you do eventually succeed, and it took me longer than most, but I did, yeah, thanks, Hannah. You treat that, it's like something you've been aspiring to for your whole life, and it becomes really precious. And I don't know any Green that's got elected that does not work their butt off for their constituents, for the party, to demonstrate to the electorate that they did not make a mistake in allowing this strange new voice into the legislature. And although I was there by myself for a long time, we have a very intimate legislature in Prince Edward Island. It's about half the size in terms of seats as the one you have here in Manitoba. Because of that, one voice in a legislature of our size has an opportunity to have a disproportionate influence. I mean, when I think of what Elizabeth May has done in a parliament of 330, whatever it is now, to be one voice in that massive maelstrom of madness that the Ottawa Parliament is, that she has managed to cut through that and be, both the most eloquent, voted the most eloquent orator and the hardest working MP, and also just the inspiration that she provides, that marriage that she has of integrity and intelligence and just incredible industry that she brings to everything. Leading by example and inspiring others, and she certainly has inspired me over the years and continues to do so. So one Green voice tends to be a voice that takes the job very seriously, understands what a precious thing it is to be an elected representative, works incredibly hard, and follows, and this is a critical thing, follows and is guided by a clear set of values and principles. And those are consistent whether you're running for the Green Party of Prince Edward Island or Manitoba or Canada or Botswana or Australia or England or whatever. There's a consistent set of values that guides Green people around the world. And that makes such a huge difference. One thing I want to say before I hand over, I know we only had 5 minutes, I've probably already gone over that. But people will say, well, and I've heard this on the doors here in Manitoba, and I've heard it in Prince Edward Island too. Well, you know what, will you be any different from the others? You're all the same, you politicians. You're liars and you're manipulators and you deceive and you're gonna break promises and you're just a bunch of rascals. And why would the Green Party be any different? And it's a valid question because tradition and history would suggest that their perception of what politicians are like is absolutely accurate. And the reason it's different, and by the way, I have watched really good people get involved with all other parties, and I'm not going to pick on any party in particular, come good people of sound character and ethics get swallowed up by parties, and the poison in politics lies with partisanship. Gosh, that's an alliterative sentence, but it's true. Good people lose their way. It's like their brains and their hearts get scooped out when they enter politics for a party that does not allow them to act and think independently. And the Green Party not only doesn't do that, they actively encourage you to act and think independently and to be first and foremost the representative of your constituents. And that's what makes a huge difference. Not just having a voice of a new party, but having the voice of a party that brings with it a new set of attitudes, a new set of values, and a real commitment to what representative politics was designed to be, which is you're there to represent your constituents. Parties were not even part of Canadian politics prior to the 1970s. If you looked at a ballot paper, the parties were not even mentioned. You were there to represent your constituents first and foremost. And if we had a system that allowed all elected MPs or MLAs or MHAs or whatever we are to behave like that, politics would be entirely different. So I'm going to pass it on now. One voice can make a huge difference, but there are many other things we need to change too. Thank you.
It's always a challenge when you have to speak after Peter. So, but I'm the second. I can tell you what it's like when you come second. And so that doesn't mean coming second in the race. I definitely won, but it's when you add the second voice. But the first part around that is that I ran in an unexpected by-election. A sitting minister resigned, surprised everybody, including his cabinet, and suddenly we had a by-election in the middle of an election cycle. And it was a safe Liberal seat. So in PEI, we have Liberals or Conservatives, and that's it, until very recently. And Peter's election at that time had really sort of rocked the house and had rocked the space, but there wasn't a strong belief that it was going to be more than a one-off, that you know, we'd get through this cycle and then we'd just go back to normal, you know, whose turn is it? Is it the red turn or the blue turn? So when the by-election happened, and I was convinced to run, because I actually said no at least twice, but when I was convinced to run, and there was this huge team that kind of pulled together with support from across the country. In fact, that's when I met Dave. So Dave came out to work on my campaign, and so did Andrea. And that kind of focus in the by-election and having, you know, an organized, amazing campaign that sort of brought people with the same values from across the country to help us sort of get that next step meant that that we were successful, and despite all of the odds and all the polls and all everybody saying that this was never going to happen, we won it, and we won it decisively. And I took my seat in the Legislature in November 2017 as the second Green MLA and the sixth in Canada, and then was re-elected with Peter in our most recent provincial election. So there are three Greens now that have, plus Elizabeth, that have had re-election. And that's also really important because we can show that, again, it's not a one-off, it wasn't a protest vote, it wasn't a sort of trying us on for size. We've done that work, we've shown that we are absolutely, you know, in it to be the best representatives we can. And in the re-election, both Peter and I increased our percentage of the vote and won every poll in every part of our districts. We also added 6 colleagues, so we now have a caucus of 8 Green MLAs, which still is amazing. We have the highest percentage of women in any caucus in Canada at 67%, because 5 of them are women. And we have 2 single parents who have daughters called Ava. And I'm one of them, so, you know, very random. But we have formed the official opposition in the minority government, which is the first time that any of those things have happened. And for those who may have perhaps seen some of the news, when Peter was elected, there was no office space for a third party. They put him in a little space in the basement. And when I got elected, there was still no space for a third party. And so we ended up in the attic of the archives building across the road from the legislature, which made for some very cold back and forth in the winter. But now they've had to actually renovate and make space for the fact that there are probably going to be 3 parties in the story of the legislature of PEI for the first time in its history, and it's an amazing place to be. So we can talk a little bit more about, I think, perhaps what it's like, perhaps just a little quick thing about some of the things that we've been able to do as MLAs. And one of those is that we have actually passed legislation, and not only more recently, but we actually passed legislation back when there was only 2 of us. So it is incredible what you can manage to do, even when you are, a very small but mighty voice. And the first piece of legislation that we passed was an economic development bill. Not a green environmental, it actually talked about clean technology and culture, but it was an economic development bill. And that's a really important part of the story too, that what we're talking about here are being representatives and voices that really show the full breadth of what the Green Party is about, that we are not a one-issue party. And the environment and climate change and being, changing the future for our children is absolutely top of mind and critical, but we are also social justice and housing and healthcare and economic development and fiscal sustainability. And we bring incredible expertise and skill set to that part of the story too. And that's a really important thing to make sure that we can say and that we can show in terms of the kind of work that we've done. So, there you go.
Thank you, Peter and Hannah. So I guess I'll start with just saying a bit of my own story. About early 2016, well, we know that the electoral reform died a sad and miserable death at the federal level, and I decided to talk to my MP about my concerns. And what I found was, after trying to have a conversation with my MP, I realized that the whole conversation was, he was representing the party to me, he wasn't representing me to government. And I also realized from that conversation, and also then listening to other people, that their experiences interacting with politicians often felt like the politicians saw their role as adjudicator between interest groups as opposed to truly listening and representing their constituents. Now, I have education in political science, and what struck me from that is that's not how I want my politics to be done. And I thought to myself, well, I could complain about it, or I could do something about it. And I decided, well, within the course of a couple of weeks, I joined the Green Party provincially, federally, joined council, and by the end of the year, I decided to run as a candidate, and I helped with Hannah Bell's campaign. So I decided if I'm gonna do something, might as well jump all in. And it was very inspiring being a part of Hannah's team, and what I learned and what I was able to bring back to Manitoba was a huge thing. So we're also now looking at how Greens, even in other places, are impacting other jurisdictions as well. So things that have happened in PEI, they're inspiring us here. The stuff that we can accomplish here is also inspiring other Greens across this country and potentially the world. So when we're talking about one green voice, we have that sort of potential as well. One of the things that really struck me door knocking in lovely Charlottetown is that having already seen One Green in action, people realized for the first time that they had a real choice. They could choose between politics the way it always had been done, or they can choose the government and the style of government that they wanted. They could see that there was an example in their legislature of how politics could be done better, and they liked it, and they wanted more. And this is not me making it up. This is what people were telling me when I was talking to them. And that was really exciting because it made me realize just how powerful and influential just choosing to behave in a different way can impact people and make them believe again that we can have the politics, the style of politics that we deserve in our democracy. And so I hope that over the course of this evening, I hope you all feel empowered through this talk and thinking about how each of us are actually, these ripple effects that are then rippling outwards and impacting other things, that what we can accomplish here in Manitoba during the next 2 weeks and in through the federal elections as well could actually have impacts elsewhere. And how you choose as individuals to what you decide to take away from this could also impact what happens in your own government, and that maybe, as of September 11th, we can actually start having those ripple effects and changes in terms of how politics is done here in Manitoba. And anyways, I'm not going to go on much more. I would rather wait and hear your wonderful questions, and I'm going to pass this on to James.
Well, firstly, thank you everyone for coming out here. Thank you, Dave, for moderating. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Andrea, for all your kind words. I'm James Beddome. I'm the leader of the Green Party of Manitoba, a position I've held since about 2008, with about a 9-month break when I was completing my articles of law. And I hope I don't have to do it 10 times, Peter. This is my 5th provincial campaign. I'm hoping I can pull it off on the 5th time, not the 10th time. But it doesn't matter, because I'll run 10 times if I have to. That's something I think I really want to highlight is we need to elect Greens. It, without a doubt, will totally change the tenure. It will change the way that the media frames questions, and it's going to make a big difference for what we can do in between elections with respect to capacity. But win or lose, just participating in the elections puts good ideas on the agenda too. We're going to get more into this, but ostensibly all parties in Manitoba are now in favor of a basic income or have made some sort of soft commitment towards it. They're not going to go as far as we were, but we were pushing on this in 2005. So we can look back 15 years, we've been pushing that forward on the agenda. So that, I think is one of the most important things, or if you're talking about putting a price on greenhouse gas emissions. Once again, when I first got involved with the Greens, it was hard to get the other parties to talk about it, and now it's on the agenda. It's still not moving far forward enough, and that's why we need Greens in the legislature to hold the other parties to account, but it's moving forward. And I promised I'd talk a little bit about what sort of led me to first get involved with the Greens. Probably the first thing for them to catch my notice was in 2004 when I was in university and the federal Greens ran a full slate, and sort of the University of Manitoba had done a side-by-side comparison. I was like, makes a lot of sense. And I was studying political science and economics, and for some other reasons I was sort of turned off by what I refer to as the gray parties. I mean, federally we've seen it similar to PEI go back and forth with the Liberals and Conservatives, and in Manitoba for decades between the NDP and the Conservatives, and not much changes. I was thinking more of doing the policy work in the back rooms, so I applied for the legislative internship, and I got the alternate position. So 7th out of 6 people. So it's kind of a kick in the teeth. It's almost worse than not getting it at all, right? It's like placing 4th in the Olympics. You did really well, but you're just shy of the medal. And so one of the hard questions that they gave me, well, you hadn't got involved in a political campaign. So I decided I'd first get involved in a civic mayoral campaign, and then after that I got drawn into the Greens. And in 2007 is when I ran my first campaign. And I'm going to focus on that one, although obviously this 5th one matters a lot because hopefully I'm going to win. But my first campaign has some sentimental value for me, because when I ran I would have been, I think I was around 22 years old. And I ran in what was then called Minnedosa, and it's now comparable to the riding of Spruce Woods. And remember that's important. It's what you'd call the donut riding, or outside of Brandon, all the bedrock communities outside of our 2nd largest city here in Manitoba, Brandon. And so I was working a job and didn't own a car at the time, and bus service was much better than it is now in terms of being practically non-existent, but still wasn't adequate to get me around that rural riding. So my campaign headquarters was a bike trailer behind the bike, and I pedaled, 200 or 300 kilometers from small town to small town, knocking on doors. And it raised a lot of attention. One of my favorite moments, you don't always get good moments at the door, as Peter says, but you can't make an omelet without cracking a few eggs, as they say. So one of my favorite moments was us knocking on doors in Minnedosa, and that's where I played hockey as a kid. And I'm knocking doors of the one woman, and she's all, I'm like, hi, I'm James Beddome, I'm your Green Party candidate. Everyone goes, I know who you are. Oh, that's great. How do you know her? Well, you're on TV enough. Oh, that's great. Well, you want a pamphlet? No. And so she closed the door. You know, you're never going to win them all. But the point is, you definitely were making an impact. So it was a bit of a deal because I was the only candidate to place. We had our Ardith Basham, who ran in Wolseley in 2007, placed second, and I ended up placing third. It was the only third place finish. And just to highlight, in 2016, we had 4 second place finishes, including Dave. So, you know, this is something that bit by bit we chip away at. But the other nice thing, maybe for me, if I think about it, is, you know, sometimes you get things that you don't quite realize. So when I did run, my half-sister, I was somewhat estranged from my dad, and my half-siblings at the time was in high school, and sort of commented to my dad, "Who's this?" And so my dad said, "This is your brother." So I got to reconnect with them after being estranged for probably about 15 years, and now my dad's our candidate in Spruce Woods. So how is that for a story and showing you what campaigns can accomplish? So I you know, there's a lot of things that we get that sometimes we don't realize. So, you know, I remember in that campaign a band playing in the Suds bar at the BU there when I kicked off the campaign, playing "You Can't Always Get What You Want," their own cover of it, and by the Rolling Stones, and that certainly sticks in my mind. You know, sometimes we can't always get what we want. I want to envision a day where Greens, you know, where I could serve as the Premier of Manitoba, and I'm sure Peter feels the same way, and it's a big weight, because if we pull off that win, it's even more work. Now we got to show what a Green government can do, and I really look forward to that challenge, and I'm sure the rest of you in this room do too, so I really thank you for your time and coming out here tonight, and I should pass the mic along so others can speak.
Thank you all for telling us your story. That's very inspiring. I enjoyed being part of the audience there, by the way. I wanted to just have it keep going, but then I realized I was the moderator. I do want to hand out some gratitudes first, because express some gratitude, because not only do we have these wonderful guests from out of town and their leadership in showing what Greens can do, certainly starting with 1, 2, and 8. Who knows what the next election is going to be? That's not far off, is it? Yeah, depends who calls an early election. But James and Andrea have taken on the role of leader and deputy leader, and they've allowed me in particular to avoid all those really important duties that they're doing, and I can just focus on Wolseley. And certainly this is more than just one campaign. It's a group effort. We have an excellent policy committee that have done a lot of good work. Council, which I've skipped out on the last several meetings to canvass, has gone on and done a lot of work. The platform, people who worked on the platform, I've gotten votes at the door because they've read the platform and read the policies of our party, and hardly heard anything from me. So there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. It's not just one Green. I know that's the title. It's a lot of people working. My wife, for example, making enormous amounts of awesome food. Yeah, like really. Half of you in this room have eaten in our campaign office, haven't you? It's such a big effort, and you know, if I do get elected, it's going to be one of many. It's not just one person. So I just wanted to say that. I want to go on to the pre-prepared questions, the ones that I have. You can probably guess what we think about climate change and what sort of actions we need to take, which is pretty much getting worse by the day. And of course, we advocate strongly on climate change. In fact, I think Lynn Lund passed a motion to legislation to increase the amount of reduction of greenhouse gases in PEI. And she said as much. She said, you know, this is a small province. You know, everybody says, oh, if China and India doesn't change, but there's PEI, this small province, and they're setting an example for people around them. They're taking leadership instead of passing the buck on to the bigger provinces and countries. So, you know, climate change is one thing. I think, you know, we don't get a pass on that, but we're pretty strong on it. But I do want to ask about what is the Greens' impact on healthcare and housing in particular, because housing is a very big indicator of healthcare in many ways. Mental health care, if you're going to recover from addictions, having housing helps. So I want to start with Peter and Hannah, and maybe James and Andrea can give the Manitoba context.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one of the big flaws in politics is that we tend to look at and address and tackle issues independently. And the question is about healthcare and housing. And there's a distinct and undeniable connection between them and the economy and climate change and social policy and education and poverty and on and on and on. And politics is not well designed the way we practice it today to understand those connections and to make policies that respond appropriately to find the solutions that we need to find to these, what I describe as wicked problems. A wicked problem is poverty. How are we going to fix that? Given how economics has changed over the last 20 or 30 years, particularly since the 70s, I would say. Housing is a wicked problem, and on PEI we have the lowest occupancy, no, not occupancy, the vacancy rate, excuse me, in the history of Canada at 0.3% for the province. Essentially, there is no vacancy, and there's a lot of reasons why that's the case. When it comes to good health, creating a healthier population, the policies that governments tend to bring forward will put more money into health care, which is really a sick care system, without actually promoting the health of individuals, whether that's mental health or physical health or emotional health. So politics is not good at looking at these problems in an integrated, coherent manner. So I will, though, take it apart and talk about healthcare, because that's my background. I was a dentist for 30 years, as I failed miserably as a politician all those times. And so I have some medical training. And there are a couple of things that you asked what we have done in Prince Edward Island regarding that. And a couple of things. We passed a motion when it was just Hannah and myself actually in the House, health in all policies. And that was a motion to highlight the fact of what I have just said, that when we're making economic policy and housing policy and education policy and policy to eliminate poverty, that's going to have a direct impact on our health, or if we don't get those policies right, it's going to have a direct impact on our health. So rather than look at a budget line, and in PEI, as every other province, healthcare is the biggest chunk of every budget of every provincial government. And there's always a call for more money for health. We need more money for health. And really what we need is more healthy people. We don't need more money to deal with sick people. And of course, there are acute problems and governments need to be there to help people who are sick. But we also have to keep the long picture in mind, and we need to put in policies that are going to create, and they won't have an immediate impact, but perhaps 10 years or a generation or 2 generations from now, a far healthier population. And the problem with the political cycle is it does not encourage us to do that. Governments tend to think in 4-year cycles because they want to get re-elected, and that is absolutely paramount in the mind of every government, regardless of their stripe, across this country. And that's a sad way to run politics. When you're dealing with these problems that require long-term solutions, governments are not inclined to do that because it costs a lot of money up front and you don't see the benefits for perhaps a long time. So there are many structural aspects of governance which do not lend themselves to dealing with issues like healthcare terribly well. But we're starting to pick away at that in Prince Edward Island, and we're going to do a budget process. The Greens will bring a different lens to our budget process when we do the budget next year. We already started this spring. I think I should pass it on. I'm starting to ramble.
That's one you can ask me about later. Yeah, there you go. So I'll do a short-ish answer on about housing, because as you mentioned, that like a practically zero vacancy rate is actually beginning to affect our functional economy. We have people are having to leave the province because they can't find anywhere that they can afford to live, and these are young professionals with their families who are leaving, or people who want to move back can't. People who are in school that might stay can't stay. People who want to immigrate can't. So it's now affecting our economy, and that's obviously got people's attention, finally. But this is not a new crisis. This has been coming for years. Last year, when we were still just two, we published the Office of the Third Party, that's what we were called, the Office of the Third Party, our integrated housing framework. And that basically really clearly articulated why we had a housing challenge and what we think should be done about it. Nothing has really been effectively done on that, but now we're in a position to obviously, it's a year later and it's a crisis. So what we're doing now is we're bringing forward legislation that should have been done last year, because we are in a position to not only bring that forward, but if we can negotiate appropriately, we can get it passed. So we're going to regulate short-term rentals. We're going to mandate inclusionary zoning. We're going to be changing the regulations around density and repurposing and adaptive reuse of properties. And we're going to be changing the way that social housing structures and supports are actually allocated so that they better take into account the needs of people across the entire housing spectrum. And that's just a beginning. But it's something that's tangible and it's real, and not only is it coming from a space of evidence, but we're actually going to be able to do it, because we're in a position to do so, and that's really an important space. We don't ever want to be in a situation where we're continually having to respond to crises, but we are in a place where we can do something, and it's coming from an evidence-based space of what has the community told us, what do the experts tell us, what's worked in other places. We went today to the Old Grace housing co-op, and it was just such a fantastic example of all levels of government coming together and the community coming together and knowing what they wanted and then having that happen. And we need to see more of that in PEI, and we're going to make that happen there. So, yeah. Let's keep this one.
Some of the things that were standing out to me, just listening to Peter and Hannah, are some of the really big challenges we have, both in how our political system is set up and how we currently engage and not make the best use of the resources that we have to solve real problems, but also the real opportunities we have to make those impacts and changes. So we heard about having sort of the big picture, long-term side of things. And I loved how Hannah brought up about the aspect of negotiating appropriately. You don't actually need to form government to make changes happen, but if you are antagonistic about how you go about doing politics, it's going to be really hard to work alongside and find cooperation with other members in order to get those changes and to bring about those solutions. I'll tell a little story just as I was heading over here. You can decide whether it's relevant or not, but I stopped by to just say hi to some of my neighbors who live in a rooming house, and they usually just sit on the porch, and I say hi to them and chat with them. And one fellow, he's like, oh, you're gonna get me that information for how to vote day? And I was like, oh yeah, thanks for reminding me, I will get that to you. He's like, yeah, I think I'm gonna vote this time. And that to me was just one of those amazing moments for me, because as we are right now in this election period, one of the things that we can also influence right now is inspiring and encouraging people to get involved in their own political system and their own governance. And so if I can find people who have felt so shut out of their system that they've felt no reason or purpose in voting in the past, but now they feel that maybe this time it's actually going to be worth it, then I think we've already made a win as the Green Party, that we've already invested in people, because a part of getting to those long-term solutions is also inspiring people to believe that those solutions are possible, and when we can do that, then also the people can hold us accountable for making sure that those changes happen. So it's as much as important about engaging people in politics as it is about people who are actually employed in the work of governance, carrying it through. So that is just a little bit of a story of one of the things that an impact that I'm already seeing in this election cycle that I think could have long-term impact on things like housing, because people who are experiencing some of the worst sides of our housing might actually start standing up and making sure that their voices are being heard.
I just wanted to sort of pick up on Peter's point about how Greens sort of recognize the interconnectedness of everything, and how sort of we recognize you're going to talk about health, you have to talk about social determinants of health. That means you have to talk about housing. That means you have to talk about poverty. And just recognizing the linkages from one to the next, because too often I think it's really easy for people to not see the benefit of preventative policies, and that's certainly true of social determinants of health. I mean, it's very easy for us to say we've had a 1,300% increase, or I think it's 1,400% increase of people having meth-related, often psychoses, crises in our hospitals, but we need to then make the connections between mental health, between addictions, how that connects together on our healthcare system. We know if people don't have a safe place to live, that drastically impacts their health output, and so obviously it drastically impacts really the quality of their life, right? I mean, that's really what it's about. I think health has been a big issue in this election, and too often we want to boil it down to dollars and cents, but no, it's about people, and it's about the quality of life of people, and we forget that, there's really strong arguments in terms of making sure that we improve the overall health of people, and not only in terms of having a more productive society, but just ensuring that people can live better lives. And so that's one of the reasons we're calling for a housing first approach, dealing with homelessness and ending the homeless problem that we're having in Manitoba and in this city by 2025. It's one of the reasons why we're calling to sort of follow the lead of New Zealand and England in terms of targeting at least 10% of the healthcare budget towards mental health. That's a recommendation actually that came out from the Mental Health Commission in 2016. So we're following on leads of what other governments have put out by ways of recommendation, but in Manitoba we're only putting 5% in. So when you start to think about how one issue connects to the next and connects to the next, and you start to try thinking about what are the long-term solutions, it's very easy, I think for politicians to think 4 years, well, let's get something that we can measure, and it's not always so easy to prove a negative. To prove how much better someone's life is than it would have been. There's not necessarily an easy way of measuring that, but we need to realize that that's real, and that's honestly what's most important.
Thank you all for that. Terrible. So I wanted to go in a different direction, because we were, as Peter and Hannah came to town, I have the costed basic income policy from the Green Party of Manitoba put on the wall, because it's not just a couple talking points, it's like 5 pages of details, and I wanted to sort of every once in a while come by and look at it and get to know it better, because it's a real policy. We came up with a guaranteed annual income policy in the 2016 election, and like James said, the other parties have followed along in various ways, which is great, because in the end, we want a policy passed, and it really doesn't matter who puts a good idea forward. As you all know, there was a MINCOME experiment in the 1970s in Dauphin and Winnipeg, and it had some really interesting results. So one of the, is Harvey here tonight? Harvey? No? One of the young researchers on that MINCOME experiment actually wrote our policy on the guaranteed income and the current basic income policy. And I wanted to start with James and Andrea sort of outlining that, because Peter and Hannah are actually quite interested. They actually want to maybe fly Harvey out, because there's actually talks with the government there on a basic income pilot project, if I'm not mistaken. So if James, you want to start with that and sort of lay the groundwork, and then we can work our way backwards through the table.
Well, I think it's important to go all the way back to 2005 when the Green Party of Manitoba first put out a policy in favor of a basic income. But I know when I joined the party in 06, I always felt we really had to push the numbers out. There's sort of sometimes might be a credibility gap, sort of, oh, this just sounds like a fanciful idea, can you really do it? And I guess the easiest way to point out to people that it is doable is, has anyone heard of old age security? You know, all we're doing is expanding a concept like that, and that's a concept that's been proven to work and make a real difference on, you know, the impact of seniors, and why wouldn't we want to broaden that out? But in 2015, and I do want to give a lot of credit to Harvey Stevens for that and doing some of the modeling, me, him, and the policy committee went back and forth and really tried to put some numbers out, and basically what I argued, it's a number of tax credits, but one of the most significant ones is known as the basic personal tax exemption. Many people may not be familiar with it, but basically it's a tax credit where no one pays tax on roughly your first, depends, it's about 11, just shy of 12,000 provincially and just shy of 15,000 federally. But the problem with that is if you make $1 million, you still don't pay tax on your first $12,000 to $15,000. If you don't even make $12,000 to $15,000, you don't get the full benefit of the tax credit. It actually doesn't really accomplish what we think it should. So if you take that money and you turn it into a refundable credit that was targeted at those making less than the low, 2 times the low income cutoff line, it drastically improves people's quality of life. It drastically, you know, reduces poverty. I mean, it shouldn't surprise people that putting more money in people's hands reduces poverty. It's sort of a kind of a truism if you think about it, but that seems to be a novel concept, right? The one that we had to push hard. I know when I first got involved in the party, there were sort of very NDP connected people in some policy think tanks in the city that would say, oh, it's just like bad cake. It's an idea that won't go away. And in the last provincial election, the Liberals said, well, we'd study it in a pilot project. We want to study it first before we implement it, and we said we'd implement it. Well, I think both those parties, sort of somewhat fearful of the support we've been getting, have chosen to respond by making their own commitments and their own promises. And I'd echo what Dave said. That's a good thing. I'm happy, you know, I'm disappointed the PCs didn't send someone to the poverty debate so I could follow up on the questions I asked the time before and in the last leaders debate, because I only get one question. I'm not sure if I'll be able to go to that one question again. And, you know, but we should be willing to work with whomever. And, you know, certainly in the last provincial debate, the Premier did make a commitment, yeah, we'll look into it because poverty is really important, but they really haven't taken that commitment seriously. So we need Greens in there holding them to account. But what we have put together is a really good proposal that it is a modest basic income. I think if we modeled what we did both federally and provincially, we'd get from the level we're at right now about 7,200 guaranteed to probably closer to 15,000, and probably even want to nudge it higher than that. So we had a truly guaranteed livable income. So I highlight that there's even more work for us to do on constantly making our policies better. And, you know, I'm willing to sit down with anyone of any partisan stripe to get it done. I mean, just to acknowledge Hugh Segal, a longtime conservative senator that's been pushing for this idea. From Martin Luther King to Milton Friedman, you've had people promote this idea. And I try to highlight to people, do any of us have family members that are of different political persuasions? Do any of us work with coworkers that are of different political persuasions? Do we not still love our family members? Do we not still get along with our coworkers? I think the public expects us to sit down and find common ground and find a way forward, and that's what Greens are looking to do.
Thank you, James. The poison of politics is in partisanship. I think I'm going to continue to use that one. and I think especially because the Green Party looks at the evidence, looks at science, tries to use that as a basis of developing policy. When we come up with something that like universal basic income, where we can show in the math that it is actually it's more sensible than our current system, that it is as affordable as our current system, and will actually have less social costs, less people falling through the cracks or actually having more needs met through this type of system, then it makes you wonder, well, why isn't everyone automatically on board with this? And I think it goes back to partisanship, because the way a lot of parties work right now is that if it wasn't their idea, you know, they're going to resist it just as a matter of principle. But that's where, again, it goes back to the voters, because when people respond to good policies, even if it's not that party's good idea, if they notice, especially, every time Greens start getting a bit of momentum, you see other parties starting to take Green ideas. So this is another example of how Greens are making a difference, because every time a voter chooses to vote Green, not because they're voting strategically, but because they're voting for what they want, then the other parties start paying attention. And they start looking at what the Green Party is doing, what sort of policies we're coming up with, and then trying to steal those ideas, which is a good thing. If we can get good ideas to spread, then we are still making an impact, we are still winning, we're still making our society better. And it's a great first step. The next step, of course, is actually getting Greens elected, because then we can actually be even a stronger voice of making it more than just a campaign promise. We can actually hold the government to account and make sure that these great ideas are passed and made a reality and making a difference in people's lives.
So in PEI, after the last election, we had a short sitting, which was primarily around the budget, but we did manage to get 4 pieces of legislation. The Greens got 4 pieces of legislation through in this last sitting. One of them was the climate change one that you heard about earlier, but one of them was actually to amend the Employment Standards Act. It was a really small amendment, but it was an amendment to include measures of poverty when the Employment Standards Board is making decisions about setting the minimum wage. And what was really interesting about that, it seems like a bit of a no-brainer. We had actually gone and talked to the Employment Standards Board, and they went, yeah, this is a great idea. But what was interesting was the debate that happened in the House about that, because it became really clear that most of the members of the House had no idea what poverty actually looked like, or why we would need to talk about what we needed to do for poverty in PEI. And even though we have been talking about this and have a poverty action plan and all these things, we had members of the House, elected members, asking questions that really showed that they had absolutely no idea that there are 1 in 5 people in PEI who are in food insecurity. In a province which is marketed around the world as the food island, we have people who 1 in 5 people who do not know where their next meal is coming from. We have obviously this housing crisis. We have a critical number of people who are living in really unacceptable living standards, and that comes down to way more than just the minimum wage. And so that amazingly eye-opening debate in the House allowed us to then push for setting up a special committee on poverty with a mandate to report back within 12 months on what is a living wage for PEI, so not just the minimum wage, but a living wage, but also to come back with a costed proposal for a basic income pilot. And that is a very exciting thing. So Dave will tell you that when I walked into the office and saw 5 pages of math, I am such a nerd. I was so excited because that is the kind of thing that we need for this committee. So, and Hugh Segal, who you mentioned, James, is actually going to be coming as one of our first presenters for that committee in October. So it is on the ground, it's doing things, and it has to come back with exactly what you're talking about here. And what Greens do is obviously they go with the science, they go with what the data tells us. We're happy to use other people's research and information. So if somebody else somewhere has done something that works, give us that, and we'll stitch something together with all the best bits. And then make something amazing. So, I really genuinely feel like we could see that first basic income pilot kicking off in PEI with that kind of commitment, and it's something that is a pretty amazing thing to be a part of.
Last week at the University of Prince Edward Island, I attended a 2-day seminar or forum and it was entitled The Future of Work. It was absolutely fascinating. There were economists, there were social scientists, there were philosophers, people from all over the country. Actually, from abroad too. There were a few Americans on various panels and a couple of people from Europe. And The synopsis, if I were to give you the sort of very brief synopsis of what the various panelists agreed on at the end of the 2 days, it's that we are watching the death throes of neoliberalism around the world, and it's not before time. The disconnect that has happened between economic prosperity, at least on paper in terms of GDP, and people's lives is becoming undeniable. Since the 1970s, the parallel path where growth of GDP and people's well-being and welfare went along fairly well, but since the 1970s it's been a little rocky, and of late the connection between well-being and people's lives and measuring the well-being of our economy by measuring GDP has gone there's absolutely no connection there whatsoever. And that leads to a situation where people have grave insecurities. Young people now can no longer afford to get into the housing market. There are no secure jobs, or very few secure jobs. Healthcare and education are much more difficult to come by. There are all sorts of examples of how in our society, despite the fact, and on Prince Edward Island, we have robust growth. We have, what did the Premier used to call it? The mighty island. He used to refer to the economic situation in Prince Edward Island. We used to call it the mighty island. And indeed, if you look at gross domestic product over the last few years, we have been near or at the top of the provincial growth for the last little while. But the problem is nobody is living in homes anymore. People can't afford their houses. Job insecurity is rampant. People are no longer going to post-secondary education for a number of reasons. All sorts of things in our society are starting to unravel despite the fact that GDP is going up. I said all that because another common thread that ran through the conference for those 2 days was the necessity for a basic income. It was reiterated time and time again, whether that be by politicians or economists or philosophers or whoever, that we need to do something because so many people are falling behind. People's lives are not improving. And I used the phrase wicked problems in one of my earlier answers, and poverty, eliminating poverty is one of those incredibly difficult things from a policy point of view to do. But we know that probably our best bet at the moment lies with a basic income. There's all sorts of wealth flowing around the planet. It's just sticking to the ceiling, and less of it is getting into the pockets of those people who need it most. And like Hannah, I'm incredibly excited about the work of our special committee and how Prince Edward Island, one of the beautiful things about living in Canada's smallest province, only 150,000 people live on Prince Edward Island, but we have the gift of jurisdiction where we have all of the authority to do the same things that every other province does. So we can set up a pilot project on Prince Edward Island and cover every islander in terms of the population of Canada very cheaply. So we will be advocating really strongly to set up a partnership with the federal government to show the rest of the country how a basic income pilot could really work, and it's such an exciting thing for us to be doing.
Oh, we're perfectly on time. We did touch on this next question. Has to do with how the Green Party does governance, even within its own party, how we keep our promises and decorum in the legislature. Maybe we could just say a quick word on that and how you've again shown leadership and changed how that's done.
Yeah, I think when I was in the legislature by myself, I was fully aware that my opportunities to have an impact legislatively were going to be very small. I was one member, even in a small jurisdiction, in a small legislature like ours. I couldn't sway votes. I had no real impact there. But one thing I could do was demonstrate a different way of behaving and being in the legislature. And I did that right from day one. I didn't crow about it. I just sat in my seat and listened attentively. And I didn't scream and shout. And I wasn't an arsehole. And I criticized where criticism was due, and I gave credit when and where credit was due. And people took notice of that. And I made a pledge to myself when I got elected that I was either going to be my genuine, authentic self, or I wasn't going to do politics. And if I can behave like that in the political sphere, which can be a horrible place to live and work, but if I could maintain my integrity and be authentically Peter Bevan-Baker and be effective, wonderful. If I can't, then I'll go and find something else to do, because there's all sorts of ways that one can contribute to society. Elected representation is just one of them. And I found to my great delight that people really liked not having an arsehole in the legislature. And I'm now joined by... I'm now enjoying the fruits of that. In one election cycle, we have gone from being the sort of interesting oddity in the corner of the room to being the official opposition. And each one of, thank you, and each one of the caucus of 8 has brought with them the same sensibility and the same willingness not to be an arsehole. And it has transformed the chemistry and the atmosphere in our legislature. I remember there was a tweet from the political legislative reporter for CBC who said, for the first time, I can take my headphones off and I can listen to the debate. He had to always have his headphones on so it would only pick up the person who was speaking on the microphone. And now, people actually listen to each other. There is fruitful debate. It's just a much more pleasant place to live and work. But not only is it more pleasant, it's more productive. And as Hannah said, we passed 4 pieces of legislation. And I know for sure that at least one of those pieces of legislation, part of the reason it was successful, a very contentious piece of legislation, was the fact that we had a spirited and open debate. And people actually listened to each other. You know, astonishingly, that's the way that the Westminster system of Parliament was actually set up to be in the first place. It just has never aspired to that, at least not for a very long time. So I think part of the job of Greens is to restore trust and confidence and belief that politics can actually be done well again, that it should be an exchange of differing ideas, and we need those different ideas and those different perspectives. But it has to be done in a civil manner. It has to be done in a way that is respectful of all people in the House. And most legislatures do not behave like that. I mean, we all know that. So I guess what we're trying to do is to bring back nobility to politics, to make politics great again. Perhaps that should be our, no, okay, forget that. But, oh God, did I really say that? But no, to give politics back the potential that it has always had, which is to find good solutions to complicated problems. That's really all it should be about. And unfortunately, we've lost our way. It's the poison of partisanship again.
After I was elected and I joined Peter in the House, there was the 2 of us sitting together in the front row, surrounded by the rest of the opposition, who were PCs at that time, and then all the Liberals sitting on the other side. And the best way I can explain sitting in the legislature in the combative approach of a legislature which is very loud and heckling, which is what it was when it was just the 2 of us. It's like doing community theater every single day with a really hostile audience. And so, because you're always on, it's this super intense improv all the time, and everybody hates you. So it was an incredibly toxic space. It was really hard. Being there as a woman made it was really hard. There was some really many inappropriate comments, and I got finger wagging, and I got all sorts of lovely stuff in and out of the space. But overall, just not a great space to work every day when you're also trying to make the law, you know, and be thoughtful and productive. So there actually is, it's not just because it's the right thing to do. It's actually about trying to get some of that, like you said, trying to get some of the dignity back into the job that we're doing. You know, my daughter's 12 in a couple of weeks, and I can't take her, I haven't been able to take her to the legislature because I wouldn't want her to see adults acting like that. But now she could. She could come. It would be okay. And that's really a huge shift. Yeah. But how telling is it when we think that we don't want our kids to see a bunch of adults acting like the people that we tell them not to be, you know, our pink shirt day, bullying day takes on a whole new meaning when you're sitting with a bunch of people who do that for a living. So it's a really important thing, and we shouldn't underestimate how important it is to change that tone. I think the other thing around governance is that in the unique situation that we're in with this minority in PEI for the first time, is we've actually fundamentally changed some of the behind-the-scenes stuff around governance as well. The negotiations between House leaders have been really important in terms of what happens on the floor and how legislation moves forward. And that's because we have a good relationship with each other, because they have to. And then the other thing that we've done is we've changed committees. And so for the first time in Canada, we actually have removed the government majority from committees. And we managed to do that by passing a motion, changing the rules of the House so that government does not have control. And you've seen in the federal level what that looks like. They can shut down debate. So committees lose their power when you can't have real debate. That can't happen in PEI anymore because there are equal numbers of representatives from each party. So it's 2, and 2. There is no majority. And that in itself is part of the reason why we feel so hopeful about the committee work for the first time, because committees aren't now just a rote thing that you have to go to put your time in. Committees are functional, or at least we hope they will be. My fingers are crossed.
This is a topic that gets me particularly excited because, as you may have guessed, I'm a bit of a nerd. And one of the things that stands out to me is how politics is done is every bit as important as what it's trying to accomplish. And I think we've heard some really great examples there of just how doing it differently can impact and influence how everything else gets done and accomplished as well. The other standard that I often think of too is that you can't govern a jurisdiction, whether it be a city or a province or a nation, differently than how you govern yourself or how you govern your own party. So if you are going to use, for instance, bullying tactics within your own party, then how do you expect the legislature to behave any differently? And so one of the things that gets me really excited about the Green Party is about this pursuit of democracy in all levels and all institutionality of governance. So how the Green Party behaves and conducts itself is as important, because this is going to reflect our ability once we actually have seats and we are in positions of power, because that's going to also then demonstrate to others how we can do it differently. But we have to start at ourselves. And so I love Peter's comment about being our authentic selves, because if we can start from that place of authenticity and being able to listen and work together, even just as members of a party, as part of a movement, as hopefully members of parliament, as leaders, this is also going to have this sort of ripple effect in terms of what we can accomplish. We have to, be the example. We have to live what we actually believe. And so this topic I could go on forever, but that is just a core of why I got involved in the Green Party, because it's more than just the policies, it's how we get things done.
Well, I want to thank Andrea for her last comments, because I think it proves what, I think what we need to prove to the public, which is people want politicians that are going to answer questions directly, that are going to be respectful, that are going to try to actually answer questions, except when things are, I often call them complex problems, but I might borrow wicked problems there, because, a lot of these things, a lot of the issues or challenges we face as a society, there isn't some quick silver bullet solution. So we can't say, oh, our one little piece is better than yours. And there's too much of that. I haven't been lucky enough, to be in a legislature and see it turn. But I can tell you from sitting in the gallery, I always find it incredibly sort of off-putting and inconsistent that if you're up in the gallery, got to have your cell phone off, can't have your cell phone on, and there's no talking, and you've got to behave as you should. And then you look down there, they're all playing on their cell phone, they're yelling at each other, and I've heard this from many people in the public, and I think it's unfortunate. I think it's off-putting for people. And what we really need to focus on is the productive work. And just a last comment, I'm glad to hear that in PEI they've been able to add more balance to their committees. In Manitoba, we have a really unique committee system where any member of the public can speak to a bill. But what I've seen successive governments do, of differing political stripes, I need not say what stripe, you can all figure that out, but they'd often schedule them with only 2 or 3 days notice, which undercuts the purpose and the process of this for the public to participate. And these are the types of things that we need to work against, because we need consultative politics. We need, the best ideas don't come from us, they come from listening to people. It's always the first thing I do when I'm trying to knock on doors is listen to people, because they'll tell you about what's going on and they'll tell you about what they likely need for a solution, and that's where the best ideas come from. And unfortunately, we get a lot of the sort of back and forth name calling and simply what I call positional politics, where it's just about positioning yourself against the other party rather than positioning yourself for something that would actually make a better world.
All right. So what time do we have here? 8:13. Good. So we're going to do about 45 minutes of audience questions. We're going to have Connie here. She is going to be a roving microphone, and she will hold the microphone for you. You will not hold the microphone yourself, because this is how it's going to work. Connie's my campaign manager, by the way, and she's doing an excellent job. I could probably spend 45 minutes just telling everybody how wonderful Connie and other members of my team are. So let's open it up to audience questions. And if I understand, there's a lot of ideas. I wanted to ask 10 more questions just watching them speak about all these things. If you have a preamble, that's fine. Just keep it short, and understand that there's other people that want to ask questions too. So I invite you to keep it succinct.
Hello, my name is Brian Timlick. I'm doing some campaign work for Dave. I noticed when I was knocking on the doors that there's a question of dignity that comes up. One fellow answered the door and asked him if he's involved in politics or if he knows anything about politics or whether he can even vote. And he says, I just got out of jail, man. He says, I said, what were you in for? And he says, guns, man, stay away from guns. I said, well, I usually try to stay away from the bullets. But he says, I says, how long were you in for? And he says, it was a couple of years. So he's out now. I said, what are you doing with yourself? How are you trying to put yourself together? And he says, I'm just trying to stay out of trouble. And I said, when you were in jail, do you think you lost your dignity? And he says, absolutely. He had no hope, no chance of getting ahead, he felt. He had no aspirations of doing anything. He got involved with gangs, he got involved with guns, he got involved with drugs. He certainly had mental health issues. We're talking about all this stuff being tied together, and I fully realize that if I talked about dignity being one of the things I want to push up to the top of the list, that it's one of many that should be at the top of the list, and they can't all be up there at the same time. But when I see people who are on the street who are homeless, they seem to me that they've lost their dignity too. they haven't really got any hope of moving forward. If we could find some way of giving them back their dignity, and of course, a guaranteed annual income would probably go somewhat in that direction, but it may need to be coupled with other things too. We talk about housing. We put people in housing, we get them off the street, okay, homelessness is one issue. You got them off the street, they got a safe place to go now, they can try to rehabilitate themselves, but they're sitting in a room where they're lonely. They're not connected with anybody. They're not feeling like they have any dignity anymore, so they head back out into the street again. This is happening over and over again. I belong to an organization that dealt with people with mental health issues that were getting work, and they were saying they tied in with this organization that was getting them off the street, and they said they're heading back out in the street again. They had enough money to get 500 people off the street. They got up to 256, and then the numbers started dropping again, and these people would put their stuff into storage and head back out into the street where they met with their friends and they had somebody to talk with. So dignity was something that I think is very important, and we need to find some way to connect with these people and get them involved, give them something bigger than themselves. Maybe stick badges on them or something, you know. But just something to think about.
Yeah, one thing that came up in my mind real quick was there's a lot of talk of the Green New Deal, which is if we're going to transform our society away from fossil fuels, there's a lot of jobs in that, and we could actually have some purpose in those jobs. I mean, there's, you know, the boring old insulation, for example. We got to insulate a lot of our homes to immediately use less fossil fuels. You know what I'm talking about, and your home's super insulated. So part of maybe restoring dignity in one respect is providing good jobs for people and working towards a larger goal. But Andrea had a comment, I believe.
Dignity is one of those things that I spend a lot of time thinking about, especially being in the inner city, because it's something I confront every day when interacting with people. One of the things that occurs to me that directly comes out of universal basic income is the ability of having options and choices, which when you're right in our current system tries to strip as much of that away from people as possible. When you can actually make a choice for yourself, so if you have, let's say, enough to afford rent, you're not just choosing between the absolute bottom options. You actually could be like, well, you know, I could have this place in this neighborhood, or I could live there. That already gives some of that power, that sense of self-ownership back to people. Now, I think Dave touched on something too, which is we also live in a very pivotal time where we can actually, you know, instead of having we could move away from this model of, this liberal model of everyone competing against each other and really start focusing on the bigger projects, things that are bigger than ourselves that could make a real difference. And we're going to need to do that if we're going to tackle this climate crisis. But one of the things that fascinates me about the science of happiness is that things like coming together as a community and working on these things bigger than ourselves are a part of what happiness is. And when I look at all of those different things on the science of happiness, what also comes out is all of those things are green. They don't require us to own a lot of stuff. They don't require us to have huge GDP economies, but they are all things that we can do, that anybody can do and be a part of, and that can actually bring us together as a society.
Just really quickly, thank you for your comments, Brian. I agree with you that it is isolation. There's a number of things that need to be focused on. I just wanted to highlight part of it too, maybe providing more support to our community organizations that are already doing good work out there. I think of the Bear Clan, as a way that someone might be doing community walks. It creates that connection for them. So, we do have a housing first approach and a basic income, but I agree with what you're saying. There's a lot to be added to that, and connecting people and creating community is part of what Greens also want to achieve.
Thank you for that, James. And thank you for your help on Dave's campaign. And without becoming too philosophical here, I think we're really struggling as a society to live well with each other and with this world. And I think that we've got two things terribly wrong, two relationships. One is the relationships between ourselves in community, and the other is the relationship between us, the human family, and and Mother Earth. And those two things have really gone sideways horribly in a geological terms in the blink of an eye. And restoring those relationships to something where there is connection and there is community and there is support is absolutely fundamental. And I do think that a basic income is one of the tools with which we can do that, because our current social services are set up in such a way that there is great stigma, there is great shame attached to that. And often people are punished when they actually try and lift themselves out of that. They lose perhaps health benefits that they may have had before taking on a low-paying job. So I think what a basic income will do is allow people to have those choices. I think you said that, Andrea. Unfortunately, we don't have the data, and I know income was a very long time ago, and it certainly suggested that there were many, many benefits to that. And so I'm looking forward to us being able to establish that on Prince Edward Island, having some real data from which we can draw. But that sense of belonging and sense of connection, which I think is absolutely fundamental to us feeling well as human beings, is something that we have lost, and it's a real sadness for me. Just very quickly before I stop, in my first term as an elected representative, I brought forward the Wellbeing Measurement Act, which was an attempt to look at things other than just GDP when we measure the success of our society. How strong are our communities? How accessible is housing? What about the health of our rivers and our soil and our air? Is volunteering something that, all of those aspects that really are fundamental to building community and providing dignity for everybody. When we don't measure them, we say they don't matter. And there are countries, and New Zealand and Scotland, and there's one other. Interestingly, all countries led by women, where they have, and I just wrote a letter to all three of the leaders actually, wondering whether a subnational state could be a part of this, where they are instituting well-being measurement as part of their economic program. So there are lots of things happening, and it's complicated, but I think there's that awareness that we've lost connection with each other, and that we need to restore dignity to all of our lives is something very important. Thank you for bringing that up. Iceland is the other country.
Hannah, no? Okay.
Thank you. I also had a question about basic income. Earlier this year, there was quite a bit of media about the Finnish experiment with basic income, and it seemed to have some difficult results, I guess, from their 2-year experiment with it. And I was wondering how the Greens would distinguish, if critics brought that up, say, because it was such a well-known experiment, how the Greens would distinguish their plan for basic income versus what transpired in Finland.
It's a great question, and this is part of the challenge we have, is that there have been very few experiments or pilots or programs, and so when there is one, there's a lot of digging at it. There's a couple of things with the Finnish experiment. One of them is it's working in an environment that already has a very different social support structures. So sort of how it's funded and how it's delivered is not necessarily comparable to what we do here within our North American structure. The tax systems that James talked about are very different in Finland. I'm pretty clear that 2 years is not really also enough to get sort of a good idea of sort of health outcomes, and so but I do think we also have to be realistic when we look at data, and even if it's data we don't like, we need to look at that and look at sort of what can we learn from that experiment and how that one was done, that we need to, what are the lessons learned from that in terms of how we design and build something here. So when we're looking, obviously we're not at that stage yet, but when we are, what we're going to be looking for is what can we do within sort of structures and systems that we have, because we're not going to necessarily be able to undo. This may have to run parallel or in transition. What are the actual needs that we're trying to meet? and what has been done in other places that we can learn from, either as something that we should do or something that we shouldn't. So that's going to be one of the chunks of data that our group is going to be digging into in detail. But from a high-end level, that was my understanding when I looked at it at the same time, as you said, was I think a combination of quite different circumstances, but obviously things to be learned from it for sure. The social structures in most of Scandinavian countries have a very different approach in terms of how they deliver services and supports. And it's something we need to think about, because what we're talking about in this case is actually about saving people.
So yeah, thank you. Thank you, Hannah.
I think we're all aware that our healthcare costs are escalating beyond control almost, and every government seems to address that in one way or another. Generally, we're not happy with it. I'm wondering how you would propose to make those decisions as a Green Party as to how to work better within the dollars that we have as when it comes to healthcare.
Thanks, Adeline. There's two sides of it. There's a lot of things that impact healthcare costs, and two things that we definitely have policies around is, first of all, there's a lot of people who end up in our healthcare system for things that are preventable, and a lot of times these are things that are also the result of poverty. So by just actually focusing on health and alleviating or eradicating poverty, we will take a load off of the healthcare system that is completely unnecessary. The other side of it is that I think, based on a lot of what I see in our system, that when I see parties debating it, they're just talking about throwing money at this or that. One of the things that stood out when I was going through the Green Party platform is talking about community health models. So actually having people in communities have a bigger role in deciding what sort of services and how resources are spent within their own communities. So putting power back into the hands of people. So that is something that I thought was quite transformational in terms of how we think about our healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few other things to add on to that. One is expanding or moving towards universal pharmacare, whether you do that nationally in cooperation or you do that here provincially. Teaming up with other provinces. I hear PEI is open to it now that they got a really cool opposition in terms of bulk purchasing together. Just kidding a little bit here, but working on bulk purchasing, we can negotiate a lot of better prices. But I think the last thing to really highlight is we talk about healthcare costs, and that's only one side of it. If someone's productive life is cut short because of a health condition or whatever, that costs us a lot, both for that person's contribution to society, but even if we want to look at it just in pure economic terms with respect to the tax base. So I think sometimes with other parties, there's too much of a focus. Once again, let's just look at the healthcare budget as if it's a line all unto itself, and rather know we need to sort of take a whole broader, I like the idea of a health lens at everything when we're looking at it, because there's a lot of ways that those connect, and I think that's not often spoken as much about. We focus more, and yes, there's a need for acute care, for more beds, for more facilities, but it's very much focusing on that and not focusing on sort of a lot of the broader interconnections.
One of the privileges that we have now on Prince Edward Island is that the Greens have established themselves as a credible voice and as a grown-up political party, and people listen to our ideas. And I think the public is ready for bold politics and for big ideas. And it's easy to say that. It's much more difficult to do it, particularly for a new party. To say to the public, you know what, there are going to be some heavy upfront costs here if we are going to adopt a preventive and proactive approach to health, to actually promoting health rather than dealing with illness. That costs money. and we may not see the results for some time, but I believe in the collective wisdom of the general public to understand that that sort of bold idea being presented by politicians is something that would be accepted. We haven't heard it anywhere because it does not bring about, as I think I mentioned earlier, immediate results. But I do think that it's possible for politicians to be braver and bolder than we currently are. I think the public is ahead of us in many ways, and I'm not just talking about healthcare, and we can talk about any of the large problems that are out there. I think the public understands that business as usual and conventional solutions to these problems have not worked and will not work, and we need a new approach. But it has to come from people who are genuinely, again, we have a privilege on Prince Edward Island because we have reached that point of comfort with the electorate, that they trust what we say, and they know that we're not crazy people, and that what we say and the ideas that we are bringing forward are something to be taken seriously. So I think we have an opportunity on Prince Edward Island to be bolder than perhaps other jurisdictions, because the Green Party there's no other party that is talking about long-term solutions to these complicated problems. But we have a real opportunity, and it's one of the exciting things about being at the sort of forefront of this political movement, that we in this small jurisdiction have an opportunity to really be a beacon of hope for other jurisdictions in showing that, well, we don't have to do things in a conventional way with these unimaginative political ideas. We can do something bold.
My question is not really a question, but it's sort of a thank you for the perspective that you brought about PEI and your vacancy rate. And just to, the standard approach to that kind of problem is to, well, let's borrow a bunch of money and put up a bunch of housing. But what you said made me think, really, the answer that solves a lot of the other questions that have been addressed tonight is, well, how can we better use the housing that we have? Where are the empty houses? Who is living alone that actually doesn't want to live alone? Who's got empty rooms that they wouldn't mind renting out? Probably for 1% of the amount of building a new flat, you can solve the problem and maybe solve a lot of the other problems at the same time. So thanks for that kind of gentle, smart perspective.
That's very nice.
Okay. Hello. Thanks, everyone. My question comes back to basic income and in some of the setup, and this is probably not an area I'm educated enough in, but how do you make sure that you, have the setup in terms of security for people to even get the money in the first place, identification, bank accounts, a lot of things that a lot of the poor don't have, and then how do you make sure that all the other services are there for them to take care of themselves once they receive the money? And I'm not against people having choice. Of course they should have choice. But there could be the risk where someone will just spend it all on an addiction, or they'll spend it all on, how do you make sure that all those extra pieces are in place to run this properly?
Sure, a bunch of great points to that. Firstly, the way we're doing it is through the tax system. So anyone who filed a tax return would end up being eligible. So that's how one of the means, think about GST returns that come out every 3 months that you receive. So, and you would need some offices that might need to deal with economic changes if someone lost a job, et cetera. And there are organizations out there that are helping people in getting their tax returns in, and you would obviously have to expand that to make sure that it could reach everyone. One of the things to highlight with our proposal, because we weren't able to get it at a livable rate, it wouldn't dominate existing EIA programs. Those would still be in existence, would probably still need to be looked at in terms of reform. But particularly important when you're looking at, say, our homeless population, they don't qualify for EIA. They don't have a fixed address. In this case, as long as they could get a tax return in, they actually would receive this money. That might be the money that could then get them a fixed address in the first place, which then could start getting them the assistance that they need. To go to the second part of your question, you're 100% right. A basic income isn't going to solve everything. It's one of these wicked problems where, you know, it's one thing that we can do. It's one tool in the policy toolkit that we can use, but we're going to need others. And I think what it'll most help us achieve is focus those resources and target those resources where we can. If we can help the people that are just on the edge and that just need a little bit of help, then we can focus dealing with root causes, trauma, mental health, addictions, etc., and those root causes. So it's actually a much more effective way of utilizing our resources.
Anybody else? No? Okay.
Hi there. This is my first time actually to be sort of part of this Green Party movement, so I just apologize for any sort of... So I have to say, I've been an environmentalist and concerned about the environment for most of my life actively as well. But the other aspect that I'd just like to maybe address is, I work for a large corporation, right? Large multinational corporation. They're often sort of seen as the target for a lot of the issues and the problems impacting. And I don't deny that there is some of that, and I also don't deny that the primary motivation for a company is often money. And so when you're dealing with corporations and economy and things like that, my understanding is that, you know, like what I've heard in terms of the collaboration, what I've heard in terms of the big ideas, what I've heard in terms of how the Green Party operates, I really like that, right? And I really like the fact that some companies have that as part of their ethos, but many don't. In my mind, companies operate in two things. They operate on profit, and they operate on threats, and that could be legislative or something that confines them to a certain action. But as a whole, they rarely are motivated by inspiring ideas and by an intention to do good for the community. So I'm sort of rambling a little bit as well. To get to my point, though, one of the things that I heard with the healthcare, which I really like, was the proactive versus reactive approach, right? So dealing actually with health instead of sickness, right? We've heard about some of the measures that can actually save income. Like I worked at a mental health facility once where it ran programs and was proactive in the environment, and the end result is that people are healthier and it saved the government money. So my question is, what kind of ideas and incentives do you have that are going to both economically not just add to the cost, right? So in other words, possibly a carbon tax, despite the fact it's redistributed, is a tax, right? To pay for certain clean acts requires money. What would be some ways in which you can sort of encourage the proactive, developing green technology, using it economically to have a better result and use some of the strategies, the long-term, the approach that you have to get there?
That's a lot of questions. Okay, so there's a couple in there that I can tackle, and then I think we can probably weigh in. So I'd mentioned that one of the pieces of legislation that we had passed in PEI was actually an economic development amendment to include clean tech as a strategic sector. That's not just words. That actually means that in terms of the economic plan for the province and funding connections into federal funding, that opens up a whole range of opportunities for innovation and investment into the clean tech space by identifying it as a strategic sector. That's really important. From a corporate perspective, I think it's really important too that when people work with the Green Party, they need to understand that the Greens don't take corporate or union donations. We only take private donations. So there is no financial hold that corporations can have on us. At the same time, you know, we understand where we're working now, there are registered lobbyists, for example. But when it comes to drafting legislation, our legislation has to be drafted in a fair and equitable, open, democratic process, which involves consultation with all stakeholders. So if we consult with a major corporation, we're also going to consult with the community that they impact, or with the NGOs who work in that area, or whoever the range of stakeholders are. So they have a voice at the table, but it's no greater than anyone else's voice at the table. And that really changes the power dynamic when we look at how legislation is affected. I think the third thing I'd add in there is that corporations need to pay their taxes. So the loopholes that we have in our systems right now are not weighted to actually to be fair and equitable. So the middle class and the average working person is paying their fair share, and larger corporations are not. And that is part of the solution in terms of where do we look in terms of where is some of the money tied up? It's tied up in things like that. So we need to be also when Peter talked about being bold, being a politician means that you're going to piss some people off, right? And I'm okay with pissing off corporations if it means that I'm bringing in legislation that requires them to be actually paying their fair share, whether that's in terms of carbon dividends, or whether it's in corporate income tax, or whether it's in showing up to the party. And so we need to make sure that our bold actions are actually driven by the right motivations. And so motivations that are around that they're people-driven, and that they're looking for what is best for the planet and what is best for our community, means that we're going to have to make some really hard decisions. And yeah, people are going to get upset about it, but we're doing the right thing, not because it's politically right, but because it's the right thing to do.
I'd like to actually answer that question as well, because I've spent most of the last 30 years working on environmental issues, whether it be international with the Sea Shepherds, with international law that's never enforced, whether it's to do with the Environment Act license for the frac sand mine, where they started clearing bush before they got an Environment Act license, then they got an Environment Act license after the fact, and they violated the terms of the license and nothing happened. I've seen laws like in Okamic Marsh. They wanted to build an office complex back in '91, and they made the law so that the minister could just write over anything and do what he wants. At the minister's discretion, he could just hand wave any project. Our environmental laws are absolute garbage, and there's no monitoring, there's no enforcement. The state of the fisheries on Lake Winnipeg, for example, there was a forum last election about the state of our fisheries, and there's a joke in the community about, conservation officers rarely get out of their trucks. They just drive around, and they don't really go into the bush and investigate what's happening with clear cuts or waterways. And the joke now is they don't have any trucks. So if you're going to be a government, and if you're going to govern properly, you need to monitor and enforce environmental laws, and they have to have teeth, and they can't have a bunch of loopholes. When you find something wrong, like they cut a clear cut too big, or they cut right up to the water line, the minister can just rubber stamp it. That's happened so many times. And oftentimes those weak laws, like in the Harper era, the Fisheries Act was just eliminated altogether. Even though it was a weak piece of legislation, at least it was a toehold to get corporations to do something. So that's half the reason I'm involved with the Green Party. If we're going to have representation of the environmental movement, that's us. That's what we want to do with this project. And corporations get away with murder, literally, with environment. It's just terrible. So sorry, I got mad there.
I just have one or two points to add to some of your comments. The first thing you commented that corporations are concerned in profit. Well, that's legislatively so, right? If you're running a for-profit corporation, you're beholden to the shareholders, and that's via statute, and that's obviously something that could be amended, right? We could look at the Manitoba Corporations Act or the Cooperative Act. We could create a new category for, say, a social enterprise industry. Certainly Manitoba is sort of well known for its social enterprise industry. So we can look at how that enabling legislation can be changed, for one thing that can be dealing with those root causes. I think the other thing is I don't know if it's the structure. I mean, you mentioned multinationals and the larger corporations, and I think that's one of the big issues. I mean, being involved in the Greens, many of us are small business owners. And I think it often defies the public perception. I'm not saying all of us are, but many of us are. But what often gets frustrating is you will have the larger companies that are set up to get first to the trough in terms of public welfare, and meanwhile it ends up impacting our small businesses and our local economies. Probably the best example I can think of is IKEA here in Winnipeg, which went back and forth between Minneapolis and Brandon and Winnipeg and leveraged about $8 million in tax credits to help pave their parking lot. Meanwhile, Penthouse Furniture, which we lost a few years before, was our own local furniture store that went under. And as a private business person, if I tried to go in there with my small little law firm and said, I want 80 grand to help pave the parking lot or anything else, they'd laugh at me. But meanwhile, Maple Leaf and Brandon with 20 million for the sewage plant, for their hog processing plant. These are the types of things where we have problems and where I think it's incumbent on our politicians to say, no, that's not fair. And it's not to be against larger businesses, it's to level the playing field and recognize, to have a small business lens first so that we can actually create a more thriving and competitive economy. Because to have a successful economy, it has to be competitive. And when we tip the scales, in favor of the already larger established companies, what are we doing? We're undermining our own economy, and I'm proud to be a Green because I think we're the only party that really, truly stands up and makes that clear.
I appreciate your question. Absolutely, it is the prerogative of large business to be after profit, and we'd be ignorant to think otherwise. The role of government is different than business of any size. The role of government is to represent the will of the people. And through that responsibility, the government has a role to look at the entirety of economic activity within their jurisdiction and ensure that it actually serves the people. That is, I think, the core thing where, if the economic activity of any company is not serving the people, then it is the role of the government to put in the things in place to make sure that it does. Because that's not the business's job, any corporation's job to do. They know what their job is, they're gonna go after it. That is the role of government. But on the other hand, if the activities that a business is doing does serve the general economic activity that serves the people, then we should be encouraging it. So it's not just a matter of, is a corporation evil or not, or if it's big or small. It's more of the role of government is to ensure that economic activity serves the people. And right now, what we have is there's just too many decisions being made where governments are allowing and supporting businesses, even though businesses might be replacing good jobs with robots, or replacing union positions with part-time and low-paying jobs, or they might be shipping capital to other parts of the world or jobs to other parts of the world that is not actually serving the public where they're wanting to do business. So the role of government is to kind of look at the bigger picture, try and figure out what will best strengthen the economic activity within their jurisdiction, and really create the framework in order to make sure that those economic activities serve the people, strengthen the local economy, give people the right types of jobs, and create an economic prosperity where all of us can benefit.
I really love that perhaps the most robust and comprehensive set of answers to any of the questions was on an economic issue. Here again, I think there's an opportunity, and again, I'm speaking from an island perspective, for us to be bold. Two of I mentioned about the foundational values of the Green parties, which are true all over the world. The first two, people articulate them differently in different jurisdictions, but in Prince Edward Island, the first two are living within our financial and environmental limits, and that's about not spending more than you do and making sure that you look after the earth. And the second one is local self-reliance. And going back to the conference I was talking about earlier on the future of work, there was a lot of talk about how the pendulum, which has swung so far towards globalization, is starting to come back. And we're blessed, for lots of reasons we're blessed on Prince Edward Island, but one of them is that we are an island. We have a distinct economy, and we have, to a very large extent, the opportunity to be much more self-sufficient than many other jurisdictions. We also don't have a huge number of corporations that are set up on Prince Edward Island because of where we are, geography, and our size. And when I look at the economy, and Hannah would be fully aware of this, when I look at the economy of Prince Edward Island, I see islanders choosing, even if it costs them a bit more money, to support a local business person over going to Walmart. Now, that's not universally true, of course, and not everybody can afford that privilege, but even those for whom it may be a hardship to go to the farmer's market to buy their food, or to source the local person who is making clothes, for example, or furniture, people are doing that. And I think we are going to see that pendulum swing back to a much more local and regional economy where there are opportunities for small businesses to make a go of it. It's a huge challenge, though, and we have created an economic system where the restraints of national governments have largely been completely obliterated, and corporations are able to move money and labor increasingly anywhere they want it. And that's been a very destructive force in the world. But I think things are starting to move back. And again, I bear no ill will to corporations. They're just doing what, and other people have already said this. I'm trying not to repeat what has been said. And perhaps I'll stop now. But the perspective I wanted to give was that it's not inevitable that we will carry on this path. There is an opportunity for us to reverse that, some of it through legislation, some of it through personal choice of where you spend your money. Every time you go and spend $1, you're spending your vote. You're voting for a local business or not, and that's something that we all have responsibility and control over.
So we have time for one more question, but it doesn't mean you can't ask any questions. We're going to have an informal period right afterwards. We're also going to have a pitch for helping out on the election campaign as well. But one more question here for Colin.
My main issue, I guess, in this upcoming provincial election is climate change. And the Green Party definitely does have the best platform for that issue. My problem is I think we might be splitting the votes in a lot of ridings. Like my existence, I voted NDP. I don't regret it. I voted Liberal, and I think Trudeau was a lot better than Harper, and we can't argue that. I think the problem is, like, I went to try to be a candidate in Dauphin. I'm not from Dauphin. I'm never going to live in Dauphin. And I'm wandering around telling people to vote or sign my nomination form. I didn't become the nominee of Dauphin. And if I did, I wouldn't expect people to vote for me because I'm not from there. I just wanted to be a nominee just to say, look, the Green Party is here. I just think there's a lot of ridings we will easily lose. And it might be almost a strategic thing to talk to the other parties before even the election and say, look, the Conservatives are spending tons of money, blah, 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 blah. I personally think election campaigns are ridiculous. I've been part of way too many of them. A sign in the ditch shouldn't mean the person that has that sign in the ditch is the stronger candidate. We should be debating policies, not who spends more money and who knocks on more doors, more or less. But I just kind of want politics to be a little more smartly thought about. I don't know, like I just am kind of sick of us being like more like the other parties, and we should just try to be more like ourselves and come up with more strategic attacks, not attacks, but just strategic plans of how we can actually get from the furthest reaches of the Conservative Party, which could care less about climate change, to being more along the lines of NDP and Liberals, which kind of actually do care about these policies. I really wish we could actually take and win a ton of seats and have a green wave, but I don't think that's reality, unfortunately.
So just to unpack your question, the first thing that has to be unpacked is that we need to fix the electoral system. And until we fix that, you know, and I get frustrated by this because often people will talk about what you're talking about. Why don't we come up with a way to game the broken system, and we'll like come up with some system way to game the broken system so we can fix the broken system? Why don't we just fix the broken system in the first place? So I think that's one of the things that's sort of packed in your question that has to be unpacked. And with that, because I did have this as a talking note, the party in Manitoba that has been most cooperative for proportional representation with my 10 plus years experience as leader has actually been the Conservative Party. When I've tried to approach the NDP provincially, they'll have no having of it. In terms of climate change, I don't know if you looked at all at what the NDP released today, but it's quite disappointing. I don't know I'm going to get into it, but it really shows to me the same reasons why I was an active Green with the 17-year NDP government and no action on climate change. Emissions just kept going up. And honestly, like, when it comes to climate change, they really are the no difference party. When you look at what they're promoting and the lines that they're delivering, they're exactly the same as what the PC government's saying, and is exactly what the previous under NDP government for them said. So it's not that we don't need to work together. I think we still need some work to convince the other parties of the sincerity of the crises. I just don't think that they see it or recognize it. And so that's why it is important. And it's too bad we didn't get you on the ballot in Dauphin, because it's about, for those people, be them 5 or 10%, giving them that option and building from there. You might be right that it may not have happened this time, but it's about building and growing from there, because, you know, hopefully, you know, maybe someday the other parties will wake up and they'll start doing politics completely different, and it'll minimize the role of what we're needed. But sadly, I don't see that happening. I think we're very much needed, and that's why the public's responding to our different way of doing politics, and that's why, you know, we're standing here with the leader of an opposition of another provincial Green Party, right? That they are the opposition there, and, you know, soon enough, I think we're going to see a Green government in Canada.
I'd like to maybe make a quick response to wrap that up, because if you look at the meteoric rise of the PEI Greens, if you compared that to the Manitoba Legislature, that would be the equivalent of electing 2 Greens in this election, and then a by-election in 2 years, electing 2 more, and then having 16 Greens elected in the next general election. That was how fast they grew. They might set a pace that a lot of us have to live up to for some time, but I think having a bit of vision and looking forward and thinking, you know, what can we really have in politics is where we want to go. But I do want to wrap things up. We're going to give everybody a couple minutes to maybe make your best pitch for why you should vote Green, and maybe continue working on campaigns here. And Peter's first on the list.
Thanks again, Dave, for moderating tonight and for your amazing candidacy. Life is funny. I never imagined in my wildest dreams as a young adult that I would ever be an elected representative, although I ran many times. I was absolutely convinced and comfortable with the fact of what I thought was a fact, that I would be running to lay the foundation for perhaps my children or anybody else's children to become elected as Green representatives down the road. Never imagined I would become elected. And I found, to my great surprise, that it suits me rather well. It's something I'm passionate about. I've become good at it, and I didn't know I could be. And it's something that the world needs. And when you have a confluence of all of those things, something that you're passionate about and you have a proclivity for, and that the world needs, that's something incredibly precious. And I am such a lucky man to be doing what I am. And I never let a day go by without stopping and giving gratitude for the incredibly privileged position that I am in today. We won in Prince Edward Island for a number of reasons. Part of it was that general dismay with conventional politics and unimaginative politicians, which is everywhere and gets displayed electorally in all sorts of different ways. But on Prince Edward Island, it was the right time and the right place for a third party that happened to be the Green Party to be that comfortable choice for Islanders to go to. So we were there at the right time, and of course, as with most things in life, you cannot control all of it. A lot of it was chance, but my goodness, have we capitalized on that opportunity. And we've been very thoughtful and very careful in how we have grown the party since I became elected, winning the trust and the confidence of electors, and creating a culture of winning. And that's something new in the Green Party. We expect to win. There was a by-election, you may or may not know about the tragic death of one of our candidates just a few days before the election, which led to a by-election a month or so, 2 months after the general election. And of course, there were all sorts of emotions and difficulties attached to that by-election, and we ended up losing it. And I won't go into the details for that, but what's perhaps important for me to talk about tonight is we didn't expect to lose. We thought we were going to win. And that culture of winning and that belief that you deserve to be the voice at the table is something new for green politics in Canada. And in Manitoba here, you're behind that curve that Prince Edward Island is leading, but it's just by chance. We happen to be there at the right time and at the right place. But I see in this election an opportunity for having met a number of the candidates here in Manitoba, to ride that wave and to be the first elected Greens here in Manitoba, and I can't wait to be celebrating that from Prince Edward Island in a couple of weeks.
So as you might have gathered, Peter's a lot of the reason why I got elected and why I got into politics. This is also not something that you expect to do when you're a single parent of a kid with some learning difficulties, and I was managing an NGO and fighting with federal government for money, and then suddenly I'm running in a by-election. How did that happen? My message is short. My message is that no matter how challenging it may feel and how hard sometimes it feels to be that you have to get into the system before you can change the system, you can change the system. You can be completely different than anybody else in there and make it work, but you need to be brave. And during my election, that was one of the slogans that we used, was be brave and go green, because a lot of people would say to me, oh, you're so brave for running. I'm like, no, what's going to be brave is when you vote for me. Yeah. And then they did. So it is a big step, and it does take a leap of faith. But the proof is in the outcome. So thanks so much for being here this evening. It's lovely to see you all.
The word I want to leave you with this evening is authenticity. It means something when there are so many people who are willing to be brave, to throw their hat in the ring, and be a candidate for the right reasons. It's that authenticity that makes it real. It's also a great braveness and authenticity when people decide to get behind someone because they recognize that that person is throwing themselves into the fray for the right reasons. We're not doing it for the glory, believe me. Not with these feet. And this is what I noticed out in Hannah Bell's campaign, is that this then transferred to a whole nother level when people realized that they could vote with their own authenticity of what they wanted to see in their politics, what they wanted their province to be like, what they wanted for their future. And so the whole idea that we could all be having a much more authentic way of being in the world, just by how we're choosing to do politics, whether we're deciding to be a candidate or a volunteer or choosing to vote differently, we can be more authentic to ourselves in that process. And that's not going to happen if we are simply, playing the game, in order to get seats and make change happen, but to come from that authentic place and use that as our source and reason for being in terms of what we're doing.
I'll try to be quick, but we're using bold vision and real solutions, and Peter, you highlighted that, and we certainly do have a lot of bold vision when it comes to policy, but I want people to have bold vision when it comes to ourselves. We do have 43 candidates registered on the ballot as of today, the largest slate we've ever had. Quite frankly, each and every one of them is on the ballot and could win. It's not impossible for me to end up in the Premier's chair. Now, I'm not saying that's the most probable outcome or that I'm putting odds down on it that way, but what I'm saying is we don't want to limit what we can do. We're limiting ourselves by our own minds, and I think, you know, having Peter and Hannah here shows us how much things can change. And so, regardless if I don't pull that ultimate 43 out of 43, you know, out of the hat, it might be a little bit hard to do. You know, if we see just Dave, and hopefully maybe more than Dave, hopefully myself, hopefully Andrea, hopefully I see a bunch of other candidates in the audience elected in the legislature, it's completely going to change the tone of the legislature. It's going to completely change politics in Manitoba, and it's also going to completely change how the media frames us. Because during a campaign, we can kind of put our ideas forward more. Outside of a campaign, it gets a little bit tougher because if we're not in the legislature, often we tend to get framed out of the stories in the way that the media puts them together. So it's so vital because I can't thank all of the volunteers enough. I can see tons of people out here who've put, you know, their volunteer hours into the party, and I know we all do it for the right reasons and because we care. But there is a reality. If we can have full-time staff and we can have resources, we can really show people what we can do. So I just want to close off, encourage all of you to get involved in a campaign, either knock on doors, provide money, help out in any way that you can. And I just also want to close off, there is a number of debates coming up for people should they be interested, starting tomorrow at 10 a.m. with Disability Matters till noon. Then we've got a fair vote one at the Park Theater. You've got one tomorrow night. I believe it's at the campus out in Wellington there. I'm trying to think of. Andrea's got a debate tomorrow night. There's the televised leaders debate that we will be participating in on Wednesday, the 28th, and also Manitoba Healthcare debate on the 29th. So I just wanted to highlight some of those upcoming events for people.
All right. Well, what we're going to do now is allow our friend from the media here an opportunity for a quick interview, and you're all welcome to come down and just have a chat, ask questions face to face. So thank you all for your really thoughtful questions. Thanks to the university here for the space, and our friend in the booth back there, often forgotten. He's been playing with the levels, and have a good evening.